My name is Lorna Whitaker. I'm 70 years old, and I used to think I'd experienced every kind of humiliation life could throw at me. That belief ended the moment I heard my daughter-in-law say, "She's not your real grandma." We were on a family vacation in the Blue Ridge Mountains, staying in a rented cabin that I'd quietly paid for without anyone's knowledge. The evening sun was casting golden light across the porch, where I sat watching my 8-year-old grandson, Logan, play with his toy trucks on the wooden steps. Then came her voice, sharp, cold, and carelessly loud. "She's not your real grandma, Logan." It sliced through the soft mountain air and lodged itself in my chest. Logan looked up, startled, his small brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Mom?" Melanie stood in the doorway, arms crossed and a half-finished glass of rose in her hand. She smirked as if she'd just told him Santa wasn't real. "She's just your dad's mom, honey. She's not really family like us. We're your family. She's just here?" Logan blinked, confused, glancing back at me with uncertainty. My heart broke for him, but not for me. Because I had been waiting for this. Not hoping, not wishing. Waiting. For 3 years, I had lived a quiet experiment. After my husband Peter passed away, I allowed everyone to assume I was financially struggling, barely getting by on a small pension. I let Melanie treat me like a burden. I let Brandon, my son, pretend not to notice. But this moment, this exact phrase was the last piece of evidence I needed. The final data point. The proof. Instead of crying, I smiled. Not the polite, awkward smile you learn to wear at awkward dinners or condescending holidays. No, this one came from somewhere deep inside me. From the part of myself I had been forced to lock away over the past 3 years. The performance was almost over. Brandon stepped outside behind her, saw my expression, and frowned. "Mom, why are you smiling like that?" I met his eyes and replied calmly, "I'm just glad we're all here together." Because tomorrow they would finally understand who I really was, and who they had chosen to become. And nothing after that would ever be the same. 3 years ago, when Peter died, everyone assumed he'd left me with almost nothing. That was partially true on paper. What they didn't know, and what I chose not to reveal, was that I had quietly built an independent fortune during our 50-year marriage. Peter worked at a small auto parts factory for most of his life. He was a kind man, humble and hardworking, but never interested in money beyond providing for our son. While he focused on the present, I focused on the future. Over decades, I learned to invest. Slowly, carefully, quietly. It started with a modest inheritance from my aunt. I never told anyone about it. I purchased undervalued real estate, invested in emerging technologies, and funded a few small businesses in our community. I read financial journals while others watched TV, and I made sure that every dollar I spent looked average. By the time Peter passed, our net worth had grown to just over $50 million. But I didn't tell Brandon. I didn't tell anyone. Because I needed to know what kind of people were they when they thought I had nothing left. I sold the house Brandon had grown up in, just as he'd suggested at the funeral, politely. Of course, with phrases like downsizing and practicality. I moved into a small apartment complex downtown. The building? Mine. But I let them believe I was just another retired widow struggling to make rent.
Brandon's calls became less frequent. Melanie stopped inviting me to family holidays. When I was included, there were always whispers about how I shouldn't bring gifts or food because you've already done so much, Lorna. They never asked how I was doing. They never asked what I needed. Instead, they offered suggestions that were more like dismissals. "You should consider moving into a senior community," Melanie once said over dinner. "It's affordable, safe, and you'll meet people your age." What she meant was, "We don't want you around." They believed the illusion I had created. I drove an old car, wore the same few cardigans, clipped coupons when we went grocery shopping together. And every time Melanie made a patronizing comment about living within your means, I smiled and nodded. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was gathering information. Watching. Listening. Measuring their behavior not just as a mother or a mother-in-law, but as a woman who had the power to change everything. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand the truth. It wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just inconvenience. They were recalibrating the family tree and I was no longer on it. But I wasn't ready to speak. Not until I was certain. So I waited. 3 long years. Until the moment Melanie told Logan I wasn't his real grandmother. And in that moment, I knew the test was complete. That night, after Melanie's cruel words echoed through the cabin, I stayed on the porch long after everyone had gone inside. Logan had hugged me before leaving, his small arms wrapped around my neck with the pure affection only children can give. "You're my real grandma, Nana. I don't care what mom says," he whispered. I nearly broke right then, but I didn't because I knew what I had to do. I listened as Melanie complained loudly through the thin cabin walls about cooking, about how tired she was, about how hard it was to host me, as if my presence was a chore she had reluctantly agreed to. Brandon, as always, said nothing. He played the role of neutral peacemaker, choosing silence over confrontation. It reminded me too much of Peter, who had also avoided conflict to keep the peace often at my expense. I checked my phone. A message from my attorney, Richard Morrison, lit up the screen. "Everything is in place. Are you ready for tomorrow?" I typed back one word. Yes. This trip had been the final stage of my plan. I had suggested the vacation, paid for the cabin, even booked the rental car in Brandon's name. They believed it was his gesture of kindness, one more illusion I let stand. The pull-out couch I slept on creaked beneath me that night, the lumpy mattress pressing into my back. But I didn't mind. It was temporary. I thought about all the ways I'd been minimized these past 3 years, not invited to school plays because they claimed I couldn't afford the gas, given paper plates while the rest of the family ate on china, left out of family photos, gifts, decisions, and memories. The worst part wasn't what they did. It was how natural it had become for them, how easily they accepted a version of me that was small, tired, and no longer central. What Melanie didn't know and what Brandon had clearly forgotten was that I had been quietly building a future not just for myself, but for Logan. I was no longer interested in being tolerated. I was no longer willing to be treated as optional. The next evening, everything would come to light. They would learn that beneath the cardigans, beneath the coupons, beneath the carefully crafted image of helplessness was a woman who had been paying close attention. And now it was time to act. But first, I had to endure one final morning of being treated like a burden, because before the truth could be revealed, the illusion had to be complete. The next morning, I rose early. The cabin was still quiet, the kind of silence that only exists in remote places before the day begins. I brewed my coffee in silence, watching the steam rise and thinking about the moment that was finally approaching. Melanie emerged from the bedroom around 9, her hair done, her tone sharp. "You're up early." I slept surprisingly well, I said, which was true. The weight I'd carried for 3 years had lifted. The lumpy mattress felt like clouds compared to the burden of silence I was about to shed. We spent the morning hiking to a nearby lake. I kept pace easily, surprising even Logan, who asked, "Nana, how come you're walking so fast today?" "I feel good today," I told him, squeezing his hand gently. "Sometimes you surprise yourself." Brandon looked at me with a puzzled expression, as if he was seeing someone unfamiliar. He was right.